Welcome everybody. Let's do our little beginning meditation and just bring our arrival into the present state that we're in. I'm just going to take a nice big deep breath, gently closing the eyes down and allowing our bodies to settle into their space. Just taking a few deep breaths in your own time, at your own rhythm. Feeling your body settle, even melt into its support. You might feel the chair, the floor. You might take a moment to focus on all that you've been carrying with you all day. And just appreciate this time to be able to put it down, just for a while. Noticing the contrast between inside and outside. The wind and the noise, the busyness. And in here, the stillness and the calm. And when you're feeling ready, just gently opening your eyes up. Lovely to see you all again. Thank you for coming. So last week we were talking about beginner's mind, and we were talking about just being open to whatever might arise and letting go of all of the preconceptions and ideas that we have about meditation, about what it has to look like, about what it needs to feel like, and just understanding that really it can be anything. It can be absolutely anything. Whatever works for us is comfortable for us. Anything that brings us to that feeling of just pausing, taking a moment, being still. And we talked a little bit, I think, about this idea that the more we can pause, the more we can practice not reacting to things, but having some space and being able to respond to them more thoughtfully, perhaps. So we're going to talk a little bit further about that today. And as I mentioned last week, each week we're going to be talking about a different attitude of mindfulness, so a different idea that might help us come more into the present. And we spoke about how often we are pulled out of the present by thinking constantly about things that have happened, that we're going over in our heads, about things that are yet to have happened, and we're already stressing about them. We know that more often than not, those things that we're worrying about in the future will actually never happen. We're just never quite sure which things are going to happen and which things won't, but we spend an awful lot of energy and time worrying about the fact that they might happen. So all of these things are continuously taking us out of being here right now. And when we're not here, we're missing so much that is going on, and we're expending so much energy. So we might start to look at that as energy that we might actually be able to harness and utilize rather than letting it go in directions where it's just not needed. So today we're going to talk about the idea of non-judgment. So it's an interesting thing to say non-judgment as opposed to just judgment. But in the idea of mindfulness, non-judgment is really, really important. So what is non-judgment? When we think about all of the things that are going on in our heads constantly, and we often don't think about them until we come to actually sit in silence and start to observe and become a bit more aware of all of these thoughts, we start to notice that so much of what's going on in our heads is judgment. And that judgment might be related to judging people around us. It might be related to judging events that are happening to us or things that are going on externally. Or it might actually also be judgment of ourselves. And in fact, this can be one of the most difficult things to let go of. When we think about what's going on in our heads and how often we're actually holding ourselves to account for things, whether it be getting frustrated with ourselves that we didn't plan something properly because we're running late, for example, as we were talking about before, whether we're judging ourselves for falling short of an expectation that we had of ourselves, thinking we should have been more like this in that situation, perhaps I shouldn't have lost my temper, I should have been kinder, all of the sorts of things we are constantly holding ourselves to. And often when we start to become more aware of it, we're very conscious of the fact that we judge ourselves usually much more harshly than we judge anyone else around us. And we often speak to other people in a way that we never usually use with ourselves, and vice versa. So the things we tend to say to ourselves, we would never dream of saying to a friend of ours. It would be probably far too rude or harsh. But we tend to be comfortable saying those things to ourselves and absorbing them. So we start to have a sort of awareness about this idea of judgment. Now, it's perfectly natural. It is literally human nature to have judgments on things. But if we can start to become a bit more aware of them, we can start to recognise a bit more that they're our thoughts, and that's actually a little bit separate to us. We tend to think of them all being completely together. But you might like to imagine that the thoughts are like clouds and we are the sky. So the clouds come through and they're in amongst everything, but we don't actually have to hold on to them or attach ourselves to them. They will just keep flowing. So that sky analogy can be a really useful one to think about when you realise that you're getting caught up in your thoughts. Now, I'm obviously getting a little bit more abstract here, so if at any point anyone wants to ask a question or just stop and consider something, please let me know, okay? That's not a problem. But this is the idea that we're going to meditate a little bit on today, this idea of the judgments that are going on in our mind. So there is a well-renowned American or Western Buddhist teacher who's a meditation teacher, and she's written a lot of books, and her name is Pema Chodron. I don't know if anyone's familiar with her. Some of her books are fabulous reads for people who aren't necessarily of the Buddhist tradition but would like a bit more understanding of that perspective. But one of the things she talks about is this idea that there are some Tibetan terms for what goes on in our minds. There's this idea of a SEM, S-E-M, which is all of the discursive thoughts and chatter that goes on constantly in our minds. And that's that stuff that we just struggle to let go of. Now, a very common place to be more aware of those is in bed at night when you're trying to go to sleep. When that stuff is constantly going on and you're really struggling to just still it and allow it to calm so that you can focus elsewhere or calm yourself down. But it can happen anywhere during the day. We're just often not that conscious of it until we pause and we stop to think about it for a little while. So there's this idea of all of the constant thoughts and chatter that go on. And then there's this idea of beyond all of that chatter is this thing called Ripka in Tibetan, which is R-I-P-K-A. And she refers to that as the intelligence or the brightness that sits beyond all of that ridiculous judgment that goes on. That if this idea that if we can get past all the judgment, that's where all the wisdom sits. So have a think about that for a moment, just this idea of the stuff that's constantly going on in there and how all it's kind of doing is clouding what is actually in our heads if we were able to let everything settle for a moment and still it. And you might come back to that idea of that snow globe. When we let it all settle, when we sit and just allow it to settle, there's so much more clear space to work with and to think through. So that's this idea of judgment. We judge things really naturally. If we judge things to be good, we hold on to them. We attach to them and we don't really want to let them go. If we judge things to be bad, we push them away. If we judge things to be neutral, then we just ignore them, generally speaking. So you might like to consider those in terms of your own lives. What are the things or some of the things in your own life, and you don't need to share this, you might just need to contemplate it for a moment, that you judge as being good things that you tend to hold on to. Now, it might be particular foods, it might be people, it might be materialistic things in your house, it might be ideas of work or self or anything you might be able to think of that are good things that you can concentrate on the fact that regardless of the fact that they feel good, that's still a judgment that we're harbouring, a positive judgment. Then you might take a moment to think about the sorts of things that you judge negatively. And these are all very personal things. We have different ideas about what we don't like and what we do like. It's a very personal thing. Start to think about some of the things that you're aware of the fact that you judge in a negative light. And it might be particular kinds of food again. It might be particular behaviour that you see in people around you. It might be particular words that frustrate you. It might be traffic, behaviour on the road. Could be anything. And then for a moment contemplate those things that we judge as neutral, that we actually just let them pass us by because we don't think strongly of them either way. Which is also interesting because they're things that we tend to miss. So have you been able to come up with a few of those things? Anything appeared in your heads? Have you had to take both of yours out? One, okay. All right. So as we go through our meditation today, and it will be similar to the body scan, just a little bit extended, really what we're going to focus on is not so much the nature of the body scan, but more on the judgments that are appearing in our minds. We're actually going to bring some awareness to what goes on in our minds. So you might notice things like, oh, I'm enjoying this. I'm comfortable, or I'm feeling very relaxed. Or you might notice things like, this is driving me crazy. I've had enough of it. Or there's a part of my body that's driving me crazy that I can feel, that's sore. Or I wish I'd taken a different position. Or, God, I wish I'd made that phone call that I was supposed to make today. Could be anything. The encouragement or the invitation today is just to start to notice those things that are coming up. And not noticing them in a sense that you're then going to judge them by wishing they hadn't come up, but more just noticing, bringing awareness to it, and then hopefully letting it go. So if you have got something to write with, straight after the meditation, you might like to just take note of some of the things that you noticed popping up in your heads. If you don't notice anything, that's completely fine. We're just going to continue to encourage ourselves to start to bring awareness to some of this stuff. And it's new. It's stuff that goes on all the time that we're not used to being aware of, for the most part. Some of us might be. So don't be hard on yourself if you're not noticing things, is what I'm trying to say. Okay? Any questions before we get started? Okay. Just before we get started, I'm going to read a little story to you that will then lead into the meditation. And I'm going to read it to you just so you get this idea of how quick we are as human beings to judge, and how rarely we actually question our judgments and stop to think about the fact that we've made a judgment and decided that something is exactly as we think it is, even though someone else might have a completely different version of it. Okay? So if you're more comfortable listening with your eyes closed, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, keep them open. This is called The Cookie Thief, and it's by someone called Valerie Cox. I'm actually going to take my glasses off for this. A woman was waiting at the airport one night with several long hours before her flight. She hunted for a book in the airport shops, bought a bag of cookies, and found a place to drop. She was engrossed in her book, but happened to see that the man sitting beside her, as bold as can be, grabbed a cookie or two from the bag in between, which she tried to ignore to avoid a scene. So she munched the cookies and she watched the clock as the gutsy cookie thief diminished her stock. She was getting more irritated as the minutes ticked by, thinking if I wasn't so nice, I would blacken his eye. With each cookie she took, he took one too. When only one was left, she wondered what he'd do. With a smile on his face and a nervous laugh, he took the last cookie and broke it in half. He offered her half as he ate the other. She snatched it from him and thought, oh, brother, this guy has some nerve and he's so rude. Why, he didn't even show any gratitude. She'd never known when she'd been so galled and sighed with relief when her flight was called. She gathered her belongings, headed to the gate, refusing to look back at the thieving ingrate. She boarded the plane and sank in her seat, and then she sought her book, which was almost complete. And as she reached in her bag, she gasped with surprise, for there was her bag of cookies in front of her eyes. If mine are here, she moaned in despair, the others were his, and he tried to share. Too late to apologise, she realised with grief that she was the rude one, the ingrate, the thief. So, just a little reminder about how quick we can be to judge when we perhaps don't know the whole situation. And sometimes afterwards we recognise Often we don't. Often we just move through life assuming we've assumed correctly. So it's a nice little story to just remind us of how steadfast we often are in what we think is right, and how often that's a really subjective assumption that we've made. So we're going to go into our meditation with that on our minds. If you'd like to lie down, make yourself comfortable. If you'd like a cushion or anything, does anyone else want to lie down? Would you like to lie down? I'm not. If you want to fall asleep, that's okay. Yeah, that's absolutely fine.